right, thank you everybody once again for joining the Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum for tonight's series with Duane. Thank you, Duane, for being here as well. My name is Nell Burkett. I'm the curator at the Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum. The museum recognizes that we are guests here on this land, historically Ute territory. We acknowledge that the Uncompahgre Ute and the Tabawatch Ute were forcibly removed from this area due to the Brunel Treaty. We hope that you will take time to visit our neighbor, the Ute Museum, located in Montrose, Colorado, with exhibits developed in partnership with the Ute Tribes by History Colorado, our state historic society. While we could never do this history justice, we do include information about Paleo Indians of the Gunnison Valley, the Ute people, the Brunel Treaty, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency in our exhibits. We hope that you will consider becoming a member or making a donation to support this program and all the work we do at the museum. You can do this by visiting our website at crestedbuttemuseum.com or by giving us a call at 970-349-1880. 1880 was the year that we were incorporated, so that's how you remember that number. Walking tours are every Saturday at 2 p.m. or private historic walking tours for 3 or more can be scheduled at your convenience. It's a great way to learn about history, and when guests come to town, just take them on a historic walking tour through the town of Crested Butte. This program is being recorded, like I mentioned at the top. It is available at crestedbuttemuseum.com or on our YouTube page. If you have any questions about our programming, visit crestedbuttemuseum.com, find us on Facebook or Instagram, or sign up for our newsletter. We always list our events in our newsletter. Thank you to our lead sponsor, Western Colorado University Alumni Relations, as well as Bluebird Realty and Bill Petros. We'll have time for questions at the end of the talk, so please do post them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we get to as many of them as possible. I've had a lot of emails this week about folks trying to get their friends registered for this series. And once again, registration is very easy. It's all at crestedbuttemuseum.com. If I try to do it from the back end, it gets a little goofy and a little strange. So crestedbuttemuseum.com, it's your portal for everything and answers almost all your questions. All right, Duane, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nell, and hello, everybody. Thanks for being on. Nell tells me we got over 430 people registered, so this is the biggest Crested Butte class I've ever had in my history.
And we have 141 people with us tonight so far.
So far. Well, tonight we're going to talk about a little bit about coal and then get right into the ethnic people of Crested Butte. I also want to thank Kevin Sanderford from Colorado Investments. He is the guy that provides the book that you're going to get, whoever the winner is, of the trivia question. And we will have a trivia question at the end of the presentation. Next week, we got a real special program, and that special program will involve Pete Dunda, the polka man from the Gunnison country and around the state of Colorado. Pete has done a tremendous job for a good number of years and keeping the polka music alive, playing at great dances throughout the Gunnison country and around the state of Colorado. So next week, Pete and I will be at the Crested Butte Museum. And Pete is going to talk about the early history of music in Crested Butte, bringing it kind of up to date. And then Pete is going to play some polkas. And for anybody who does not know how to polka, Nell and I are going to do a couple of polkas and show you how. So we want everybody to have their dancing shoes on at 7 o'clock on March the 4th. The next presentation, Pete Dunda and the history of Crested Butte music, and then we're going to get right into some great polkas. These sessions are going to go on through April the 15th. We got 12 of them. Today, I'm going to start off by giving you a kind of a little disclaimer here. When I talk about immigration, which we will in a moment or two, I want to let you know that my grandfather and grandmother and father both came over from Belgium. My grandfather in 1919 and my grandmother and the children in 1920. So I'm a little biased towards immigrants. I also want to remind you that when I first came here in 1962, I had come from a Belgian farming community where everybody was off the boat from Belgium and they all spoke a language that was not English. And those who learned English spoke with a clipped accent. So when I came into Gunnison to work at Western State on or about Labor Day 1962, I didn't know anybody, and I thought, well, I'm going to go up to Crested Butte, see the town, and maybe have a glass of beer. And I came into Crested Butte, and everybody was talking either with a foreign language or a clipped accent. And I said, Vandenbusche, you are home. Because that's how I met Johnny Panion, Paulie Panion, Josiah, Johnny Krismanich, Rudy Sedmak, and all the other great people that it was my privilege to know for a long time. We are talking about Crested Butte as one of the great coal towns of the American West. And last time I told you, and you're looking at the Horace Mine, sometimes called the Pueblo Mine, as you come into Crested Butte. And as you come into Crested Butte, there were 3 mines on the left side of the road. One was the Robinson, one was the one you're looking at, the Pueblo, and the other one was the Buckley, with the Rio Grande Railroad running right underneath, and the coal came out of the mine, down the tramway, into the tipple, and then into the railroad cars, and then onto the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. We also talked a little bit about the Pershing Mine and the Peanut Mine, and Nell's going to put a couple of those up. We go to the next photograph. That is Hoot Gibson and Hob Turner making their way to the Buckley Mine up Gibson Ridge in the wintertime in 1927. Next photo, Nell. The next photos now are going to be of the Peanut Mine and the Pershing Mine. And that is the Peanut Mine located on today's lower loop and out by Peanut Lake. Keep right on rolling, Nell. Another shot of the Peanut. That's kind of getting the cars out on the tipple, and then you loaded them onto the railroad cars down below. Another one. There is a worker standing on the track right next to empty coal cars at the Peanut Mine in the 1920s. Next. There is a great shot of the Peanut Mine buildings and Peanut Lake, again, 1920s, out by the lower loop. Next. Now there is the Pershing Mine, and that one was located a little bit to the south of the Peanut. And the next photo will show you a better shot of the Pershing. And here we go. Now that one is, the Pershing Mine was located right about where Erickson's Steakhouse was on the other side of the road, and where Jay and Karen O'Neill had a house for a long time and they just sold it. So that brings you up to date on the lower loop. Last time we talked about the big mine. So that takes us into 6 mines. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit right now about, and there's another shot of the Pershing. This is the tipple coming down into the railroad cars. There are 3 types of coal produced in Crested Butte. One was bituminous or soft coal. That was the big mine in the Jokerville. Another type was coking coal. That came out of the 154 coke ovens. And then the last one was anthracite coal, and that's where I'm going to start today. A couple of minutes on each. One of the great anthracite mines in Crested Butte and one of the great anthracite mines in the West was called Smith Hill. And that was named for Howard Smith, the father of Crested Butte, who purchased Smith Hill in 1879. And Smith Hill was located above the Slate River, 4 miles north of Crested Butte and 1,600 feet above the river. Smith, along with 2 others, purchased that hill because of high-quality anthracite coal. The original name was Cloud City because of its high elevation, but the name was soon changed to anthracite because of the coal. The mine itself was up high at Smith Hill, and in December of 1882, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad completed a 4-mile spur from Crested Butte up the Slate River and to anthracite in Smith Hill. Anthracite, which was where the breaker was down below along the Slate, was 80 feet high and built with 360,000 board feet of lumber. So you got Smith Hill where the mine is 1,600 feet up, and then you got anthracite where the coal breaker and the railroad tracks are down below. This was at the time the only coal breaker west of Pennsylvania, anthracite breaker. On top is Smith Hill, and there a 200-foot long track ran from the mouth of the mine to the head of a very steep tramway. And that tramway ran for 1,628 feet from the mine at Smith Hill down to the anthracite breaker down below, down a very steep incline of 33 degrees, the longest and steepest in Colorado, and was a gravity tram. The empty cars coming down pulled the full cars coming down pulled the empty cars going up. Once the coal was in the breaker, they were broken up in a crusher from which they passed into revolving screens with meshes which filtered through 5 different sizes. And the sizes were called fish, orange, nut, pea, and slack or waste. In 1884, the Colorado Coal and Iron Company, soon to become known as the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned the mine. 200 people lived in Smith Hill, had a post office, a school, and a library, and life up there was pretty hard and dangerous. Early in the morning of January 31, 1883, an avalanche smashed into one of the boarding houses, killing 6 people and injuring 15. Between 1882 and 1903, when it shut down temporarily, the mine employed 70 miners and turned out an average of 5,000 tons of coal a month. It shut down from 1903, and then the following year, a new company, Anthracite Mesa Coal, ran the mine from 1904 to 8. From 1908 to 1913, didn't operate. In 1914, when World War I broke out, despite a fire which destroyed the giant breaker, new owner Frank Buckley built a new breaker and ran the mine again and produced coal for the needed fuel that you had to have during World War I. Another fire in 1923 destroyed the new breaker, but the town and the mine thrived through World War I in the 1920s. And then ultimately the Depression, high transportation costs, and gas and electricity ended the mine. The miners left and went to work at the big mine. The huge slack coal dump by the breaker, which was thought to be worthless by locals, was bought out by the American Smelting and Refining Company in the early 1940s. They bought that dump of 400,000 tons of slack coal for $1.25 a ton, and it was used in a steel fluxing process. This greatly aided the local economy. In 1947, the Crested Butte anthracite spur was torn up, and that ended the history of anthracite, one of the 2 great anthracite mines in the history of the Gunnison country. The other great anthracite mine, and one of the best in the West, was located about 11 miles west of Crested Butte and not far from Kebler Pass. It started off as a town called Ruby Anthracite in 1880, and very early it was a tent city through the 80s as coal and silver miners prospected there. In 1887, John Kebler, and now you know how Kebler Pass got named, of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, bought the coal lands and became excited about the anthracite coal there. The Denver and Rio Grande ran an 11-mile narrow gauge branch line to Ruby Anthracite in 1893, and the new coal camp started in that year. In 1897, the Floresta Mine opened, and the name of the coal camp was changed 4 years later in 1901 to the name of the mine, Floresta, which in Spanish means forest. Tremendous snow hampered operations, with the Rio Grande only getting through 6 months out of the year. Even double headers and triple headers, and using a rotary, could not break through up to 25 feet of snow. Floresta got a post office in 1897. 100 men were employed at the coal mine, and the population got up to 250. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, however, found it very hard to keep miners there, even though they paid them $4.25 a day, more than anybody else was making in the Crested Butte area. heavy concentration of gas, a 6-month-long season, and a lot of faults in the mine kept miners away. In 1898, one of the great coal breakers in the nation, the largest west of Pennsylvania, was built for $98,000 at Floresta, 114 feet high, 76 feet wide, 124 feet long, and it handled 2,000 tons of coal every 24 hours. The coal veins in the Floresta mine were 3 feet wide and unfortunately pitched badly, making it real tough to mine. Mules hauled coal out of the mine to the tramway, and from there the coal went 1,400 feet and was deposited in the tipple in the breaker. It then went through 5 big revolving screens and was broken up and sized before it got to the bins on the lowest floor just below the railroad tracks. Housing included log cabins built by miners and 9 CF&I company houses and a CF&I boarding house for 90 men. Floresta had its own sawmill, and it also had a Colorado supply store and had a Western Union telegraph office. School was held there for 15 to 20 students during the summer months. Between 1898 and 1918, when operations ended, the Floresta mine turned out 800,000 tons of anthracite coal. During the winter, 10 families stayed there, with men doing developmental work at the mine. The town died with the end of the mine after World War I, and a 1 million ton slag dump was sold during the 1920s. The Denver and Rio Grande pulled out the rails in 1929, and today a private company owns the entire area. When the big mine closed in 52 and the tracks of the Rio Grande were pulled out in 55, it looked like Crested Butte was going to become a ghost town. It had 300 people living in town by 1955. As we leave the anthracite coal mines, we now get to the people who worked in the mines, and these were the immigrant people of Crested Butte. Immigration is the oldest and most persistent theme in U.S. history. The United States, with the Statue of Liberty, became the melting pot of nations and made the United States the greatest nation in the world. And I'm going to quote you the words from the Statue of Liberty. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air bridge harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. My grandfather and father and grandmother never forgot coming through the Statue of Liberty, right by the Statue of Liberty. They had a lot of hope that they never had in the old country of Belgium. Immigrants came to the United States because of a number of reasons. War, constant wars in Europe, hard times, a class system they couldn't get out of, and hope. From 1865 to 1900, 33 million immigrants came to the US. That's almost 1 million a year. They made many contributions, and the United States and Crested Butte became a nation and a city of immigrants, a melting pot. And here's what the immigrants did. They did the backbreaking work that others didn't want to do. They made the US the richest culture in the world, and they increased population and settled wilderness areas that no one else wanted to go into. The old immigration came from Northwestern Europe, and these are people from England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Scandinavia, and Germany. They were WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were called Cousin Jacks and Cousin Jennies, and most of them were Protestant, and most of them spoke English. Many of them went into farming in the Great Lakes and the Midwest, and others became some of the best hard rock miners in the world, such as the guys out in Wales. The Southeast Europeans were the new immigration. They came later in time, and they were from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and an area known as the Balkans. There are more Polish people that live in Chicago than live in any city in Poland. And there are more Jewish people in New York City than any city in Israel. The early view of immigrants was that they would conform to Anglo-Saxon patterns of behavior, and they would be assimilated. So they expected to speak English and adopt US customs. Unfortunately, that's the way I grew up, and I always wished that I would have learned a foreign language. Later views wanted immigrants to maintain their identities. The great Mary Anton, an immigrant, said, "We came not empty-handed here, but brought a rich inheritance." And those people brought their philology, their language and their customs and their art and their music and their traditions, all put together, the folk spirit of those people. Some of the immigrants who made names for themselves in the United States: Alexander Graham Bell, Joseph Pulitzer, Nikola Tesla, Louis Agassiz, John Peter Altgeld, Jacob Riis, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, and many others were all immigrants who made contributions, great contributions in the US. A reaction came very early against immigration, and here were the people who didn't like it. Number one, labor unions didn't like it because immigration meant too many workers, and that might drive down the wages. Secondly, social reformers didn't like them because the immigrants lived in slums with poor public health and were exploited as poor people. And as long as illiterate immigrants came in, you could never solve that. And the last crowd that didn't like them were Nordic supremacists, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who thought that they were a little better than anybody coming in from Southeast Europe. The way to keep immigrants out of the United States was by passing literacy tests and establishing federal laws and quotas, like the Immigration Acts of 1917 and 1924. The most people allowed in, the biggest quotas always came from Northwestern Europe. The least quotas came in from Southeastern Europe. The early foreigners who came to Crested Butte were from Canada, Norway, Sweden, and the British Isles, with names like Ross and McNeil and Gardner and McCluskey. And they were sprung from the reality of the British and the Welsh coal mines and the tin mines also of Wales. There, many of the boys went into the mines at 8 or 9 because the seams were small and only small children could get into mine. And many never lived to see the light of day. They went to the mines at dark, they came out at dark, and they worked 7 days a week. And many of them died of coal dust in the lungs at 19, never having seen the light of day after the age of 7. There were no child labor laws there, and not in the United States either. There were 3 barbaric rules. One was called contributory negligence. If you contributed to your own negligence and it was your fault you got hurt in the mine, don't blame the company, sue yourself. The fellow servant rule. If your fellow servant caused your injury, don't blame the company, sue your fellow servant. And the final one was the rule of risk. If you worked in a foundry or on the railroad and in a coal mine, you assume the risk. So if you got killed or injured in a mine, don't whine about it. You assume the risk when you went into the mine. How Green Was My Valley is a great movie about the coal mines of Wales. large numbers of immigrants were attracted by gold and silver mines in the US. And for the first 15 years, almost all of the people of Crested Butte came from the British Isles and worked in the gold and silver mines and also in the coal mines. There were three great empires in Europe, and they were all fading by the end of the 19th century. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the headquarters at Vienna, the Ottoman Turk Empire, with headquarters at Istanbul, and the Russian Empire, and that was located in Moscow. By the end of the 19th century, those empires which had existed for hundreds of years were in the process of breaking up. Lord Turgot, a French foreign minister, once said, "Colonies are like fruit on a tree. When they get ripe, they drop off." And all these ethnic people that were part of the Austro-Hungarian and other empires, they were dropping off. They wanted to leave. And Voltaire, "Nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come." And the idea of freedom and liberty had come. All of the people from those empires were poor agricultural people, mostly Catholic, and often forced into the army of the empires. By the 1890s, they sought a better life. Many of them left their provincial agricultural villages of orchards and vineyards and came to the US. When my grandfather first came in 1918, he was like a lot of other immigrants. Strange country, didn't speak the language, very little money, didn't know where he would wind up. I mean, those people had to have a lot of courage. And the people who came into Crested Butte were the people that came from those empires with names that I've already mentioned. I'll mention again: Panion, Sedmak, Krismanich, Mahelich, Starika, Saya, Spreitzer. These were the people who now came from the old country and began to work in the mines. They were from Slovenia, Slovakia, Armenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, the Czech Republic, Serbia. And in Southeastern Europe, every ethnic group lived in a different valley and they all hated each other. And some were Muslim and some were Christian. So ethnic and religious division. There are some of the people in a country later on called Yugoslavia that are cutting hay with a sickle bar. That's why I still got it from our farm. That's what they used in 1920 before mechanization. And these are some of the people who made their way to Crested Butte. They were completely ignorant of mining when they got here. They're agricultural people. They didn't know very much about industrial jobs. And as such, they were considered stupid. There are some of the ethnic people on a hunt. This is in Crested Butte in the 1890s. The Slavs in Crested Butte kept to themselves. And early they crowded into a good number of boarding houses. Many Slavic women rent them. Margaret Golubich always looked at a prospective boarder's hands before accepting them. If they weren't rough from work, the man was turned away. Most of the men who came were young and single, forced to leave family behind. Relaxation and companionship was found in the saloon. And there is Rosich's Saloon, Elk Avenue, now the public house, with a little girl sitting next to a spittoon, probably a little too close for comfort. There in the saloon, one could drown your sorrows, overcome weariness from a hard and long day, meet one's friends, buy steamship tickets and money orders for folks in the old country, play poker, eat, dance, have one's letter written, enjoy meeting a girl, subscribe to a newspaper, pay one's lodge and club dues, and maybe even your church dues. Many businessmen in Crested Butte got their start by running a saloon. Martin Verju was the first Slav to own a store. He competed with 7 others, including the Colorado Supply Store owned by the CF&I. And in 1926, he grossed $90,000. And there you can see Elk Avenue with the snow piled up and Sukel's Beer Garden. John Rosich, another Slav, had Rosich's Bar, now the Public House. He came to Crested Butte at 21 in 1888, later became a rancher and a businessman, and died in 1947. There's a shot of Cochevers, and that's Chuck Wirtz, the bartender. And from right to left, you got Josiah. He's got a musical instrument, Cheat Sedmak, Botsy Spreitzer, and towards the end, I think that's Fritzy Cochever. Early, the Slavs were detested because they took jobs, they were Catholics, they spoke a different language, and when World War I broke out, they were considered very suspicious. Working in the coal mines was very difficult. Some of the miners worked on their knees because the seams were small. It was damp and cold, and there was water in the mines. In good conditions, a miner could shovel 30 tons of coal in a day and make $2 to $3 a day. Periodic strikes hurt the immigrants. One strike came in 1890 and led to the Italian Council in Denver to ask the Elk Mountain Pilot newspaper in Crested Butte to publish a telegram begging miners to stop the strike against the CF&I and, quote, trust in the justice of the authorities. Another strike came in 1903 when the United Mine Workers under John Mitchell called out 150,000 coal miners nationwide. This led one of the owners of a coal mine and also the owner of the Reading Railroad, George Baer, to say this, and I quote, the rights and interests of the laboring men will be protected and cared for, not by labor agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God in his infinite wisdom has given control of the property interests of this country. In other words, the owners were approved by God and everybody else is riffraff. This led to one of the real great comedic writers of the time, Peter Dunn or Mr. Dooley, to reply, what do you think of the man down in Pennsylvania who says the Lord and him as partners in a coal mine? Has he divided the profits? Crested Butte women who spoke no English learned to shout, go home scab, at passing strikebreakers. Sylvia Smith, fiery editor of the Crested Butte Weekly Citizen in the early 1900s, wrote negatively about the Slavs. And she declared in one of her articles, quote, a fracas occurred at the Croatian saloon Sunday night. A number of Emperor Joseph's former subjects got into a wholesale mix-up in debating the work or no work idea, and the fighting host would have filled the trenches with corpses if the sheriff had not shown up. Paul Panion Sr. in 1903 tried to rid the town of scabs gathered at the Croatian Hall Saloon. He lit the fuse to 12 sticks of dynamite, but was unable to get into the building. Instead, he hurled the powder into the street, blowing a huge hole in Elk Avenue, but not injuring anybody. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company had a company town in Crested Butte. Company store, company housing, company playground, and paid people off in script. And they always said that a mule was worth a lot more than a man. A mule cost 70 bucks. If a guy got killed in a mine, you just hired somebody else. And there is the Colorado Supply Company in the 1920s along Elk Avenue in Crested Butte. To help the immigrants in Crested Butte, fraternal societies were founded. This is the inside of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company store. And these societies then spread to Crested Butte. What they wanted to do is preserve the culture and the Catholic Church. Another picture of the company store. The first fraternal order came in 1893, St. Joseph's, founded by the Slovenes, Eagles of the Plains, Society of St. Barbara, Society of the Blessed Virgin Mary, were all other fraternal organizations that came. All members paid dues, went to church, and helped those out in need. And there's a guy standing in front of the CF&I Hotel. Marching on holidays or whenever a visiting dignitary came, fraternal parades were colorful. And there's one right on Elk Avenue around the turn of the century. They had flags. All members wore uniforms. The Catholic Church was very important and held dances to pay for the new St. Patrick's Church. The Catholic Church, however, became overbearing. The priest demanded a $10 fee for saying Mass in town. That's a tithe. Local people were bled white to contribute to state and national organizations. And I'll give you a personal example. We had a priest, a French priest in our community called St. Nicholas, Belgian farming community. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and he kind of controlled everything lock, stock, and barrel. And when you turned your envelope in with money you donated to the church, Father Coignard at the start of Mass would stand up in front and he would tell what everybody had given. So he'd say, Van Dam, $1. $1 meant $1. Read them off, who gave what. And whoever gave the most always had the front pews. And needless to say, the Vandenbusche family was in towards the back on the right side. Anybody who was sick or getting aid from a fraternal organization was not allowed to attend any entertainment or do physical labor, and certainly not be caught drinking. Steve Krismanich Sr. in 1914 set up a night school and taught English at St. Mary's Hall. St. Mary's bought the former Ninth of Pythias Hall in 1902 for $1,750. It was located on Elk Avenue, and that big metal-clad building was jacked into log rollers and then dragged backwards to its present location on 2nd Street. The move took a month, with men working after their shifts or on weekends, with horses also used. Crested Butte at its peak had 8 fraternal organizations. When the big mine closed in 1952, the Croatian Hall was sold 7 years later to Dr. Hubert Smith of Texas, who used it for his Law Science Academy. The remaining 4 lodges met in Frank Yelenick's home. He was an officer of each. As more people moved out of town, the lodges ceased to exist. The women of Crested Butte were great cooks. Kibasi, sausage, hajmat, soup and stew, pavitika, nut bread, and potitsa. I always get some from some of the native people every Easter, and I love it. All nationalities needed heroes. And the Slavic people of Crested Butte had a guy named Peter Zibich of Serbia, who wasn't from Crested Butte, but he came into Crested Butte. In Crested Butte in 1911, he lifted the wheels of a narrow gauge flat car off the track. And he also held on each arm a team of Joe Akers draft horses, pulling his arms together and setting the horses back on their haunches. Crested Butte also had a great baseball team. And they always would beat Gunnison around the turn of the century and after, because they had a great pitcher named Jap Pitzer, who later on played minor league ball. And Pitzer worked for the CF&I Railroad, but the CF&I really only had him there to play baseball and win bets for the minors. Tony Mihelich was a great baseball player, the guy of Tony's Conoco. He played shortstop. Names were also altered in Crested Butte because of immigrants. Frank Arajim was named Orazin by a school teacher, and Pete Kuznicic was called Kissimmee-Quick by his neighbor. My father's real name was Joseph in Belgium, but the Belgians couldn't pronounce Joseph in English, so they would say Jos. And my dad's name became George, but his real name was Joseph, and my sisters didn't even know that. The Italians were the largest initial group in Crested Butte, and they and all the immigrants to town brought their customs, tradition, religion, music, and art and language with them, their philology. And there's a great book written about the Italian people in Crested Butte, and it's written by Richard and Cara Grary, and it's called The Spaghetti Gang. And Rich was there from 1931 to 46 while he was growing up. Very early, Crested Butte, because of the many nationalities it had, became very cosmopolitan. Very early on, there was trouble, fightings and shootings and ostracism between different ethnic groups, much of it concerning women. Mrs. Sarah Allen was born in Crested Butte in 1883. I interviewed her in Grand Junction in 1971. She remembered the town when it was Anglo, and then the Southeast Europeans came in. She told me that Italian women used to bake their bread in the coke ovens on Big Mine Hill, and the Anglo kids would gather around and watch. A can of beer would be passed around until finished. Then another made the round. One Italian family, otherwise clean as a whistle, kept a cow in the kitchen in the evening. Peter Rollo, an Italian, was involved in a knifing incident in 1900 and returned with a gun and began shooting, wounded one. The Elk Mountain pilot declared, "The Italians made good citizens after becoming Americanized." Mike Welch, half Slavic, started the La Calabria soda water bottling works in 1899. It produced cider, soda water, mineral water, root beer, birch beer, and ginger ale. In 1970, I interviewed Philip Yaklich, who was 85. He had been born in Slovenia in 1885, later Yugoslavia. He came to the US on a French ship in 1904, went to Pueblo and then Irwin. Before coming to Crested Butte, he worked in the coal mines of southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. In Crested Butte, he worked at the Buckley, the Peanut, Smith Hill, Robinson, and Pueblo mines, and also in Floresta. When he worked at the Buckley, he rode a horse a mile to and from work. The miners were paid on the contract system. You were paid for how much you produced. If you hit rock or the roof fell in, you cleaned it up without pay. They were called idle days. Philip described the work in the mines as dirty, dangerous, and hard. And later on, he also worked at the Augusta mine up Poverty Gulch for a few years. While working at the Buckley, he met Joe Berta, the man of the mountains, who later on lived up Ohio Creek and worked at Baldwin in the mines. Berta had been involved in the Ludlow massacre. Philip's wife's maiden name was Kochever. She was the daughter of Jake Kochever, one of the first people from Southeastern Europe who came into Crested Butte. He came in 1884. Mrs. Yaklich was born in 1894. Her father opened up the peanut mine. She was the first Slovenian child born in Crested Butte. Mrs. Yaklich's mother ran a boarding house for 24 in the early days, and many of the boarders, mostly Slavs in the early days, stayed at home at night to avoid getting beat up. When Mrs. Yaklich got married in 1908, there was a big reception. 12 Irish approached the hall where the reception was, and when asked if they had been invited, they said no. Mrs. Yaklich said, "If you come in, look what's waiting for you." And they looked at 50 big Austrians who were at the wedding. And that was the last wedding that was ever interrupted in Crested Butte. The Ku Klux Klan was very big in Crested Butte and in Colorado and in the US in the 1920s and 30s. They held parades in town. They burned crosses on Chocolate Peak west of town. They hated Catholics and Jews and blacks and immigrants. As H.L. Mencken, the great writer, said, They gave the village idiot a chance to dress up with a white hood and white clothing and engage in hocus pocus. Finally, courageous newspaper editors and income tax evasion took them down. Crested Butte had much prejudice early, but never had any ghettos. It was too small for that. Disease was impartial. Mines were dangerous for everybody, and time had a way of healing things. It was ironic that by the time the Slavs and other minorities found acceptance in Crested Butte, they had become the dominant group in town and no longer needed it. One Slavic writer of Crested Butte had said this: "The sorrows and struggles, the hopes of the first and the hesitations of the second generation in Crested Butte left scarcely any marks on the present third, which by its education, standards, and ambitions can no more be considered Croatian, Serbian, or Slavic at all, neither by authorities nor by themselves. Having in some cases changed their names for convenience, they are now Americans and nothing else, justifying thus the aims of immigration." When I used to ask my father why Grandpa didn't want to go back to Belgium and see his relatives and his brothers and one sister, my dad said because he thinks when he leaves, a war is going to break out and he won't be able to get back. My grandfather and father never referred to Belgium. They always called it the old country. And they were happy to leave and become Americans, even though they were proud of where they came from. The first and second generation of Crested Butte, and Nell, you're going to start putting those photos up now, could never develop their full potential. This is Botsy Spreitzer in Cochevers. They never developed their full potential. The greatest memorial to these people will always be their work ethic. That's Pitzer, incidentally. Pitzer Sporsic, not Botsy. The greatest memorial to these people will always be their work ethic, the fun they had, the strength in the face of hardship, and their very neat homes and gardens, and their sacrifices for their children to give them what they never had, and the contributions they made to make the U.S. the greatest and most revered nation in the world, and Crested Butte one of the most important coal towns in the country. Go back to that previous photo, Nell. That's Whitey Sporsic, who landed on Omaha Beach on June the 6th, 1944. Next. Rudy Sedmak, who worked in almost all the mines at Crested Butte and then worked at the ski area. Next. Tony Capuchin, Tony's Tavern. Next. This is in Cochevers, a great photo by Sandy Hickok, left to right. Emil Lunk, Germany. Frank Hodgson, England. Tony Danny, US. Johnny Panion, Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ralph Falsetto, Italy. This is Memorial Day, 50 years after World War I ended. During that war, they're all trying to kill each other. Yeah, that's Frank's bar, Frank and Gals. Thank you very much. You can see Frank's on the window there. And now 50 years later, they're reminiscing. Frank and Gals, one of the great bars in Crested Butte. And that, ladies and gentlemen, with the final photograph, I'm working on my history of the Gunnison country. There are my two great friends who are working at the top of the ski area, Johnny Krismanich on the left and Rudy Sedmak on the right. And it was my pleasure and my honor to know all those great immigrant men and women of Crested Butte. And that is it. And we now go to the trivia question. Nell, tell them how to answer the trivia question.
All right, so you're going to answer the trivia question in the chat. First one that we see on our end will win. Sometimes these trivia questions have two parts, and if they do, you got to get both of them in there, not just one. And sometimes the internet connection is different on our end than it is on yours, so it's whoever we see on our end first wins the trivia, wins the prize. All right.
The prize is my book on Crested Butte. So here is the trivia question. What was the name of the great Crested Butte pitcher who always beat Gunnison in baseball?
We've got Kim.
Who's that first one?
We got Kim.
I need the first and the last name.
Ooh,
First and last name.
first and last.
There it is, Kim Kohler. I'm going to give her, it's Jap, J-A-P, but we're going to give it to her. Kim, we're going to get your address. We're going to send you the prize. Now, anybody else who wants to get on the chat board with any questions, I will be very happy to attempt the answers. So we're ready for the chat board and the questions.
All right, I think I saw some questions come in the Q&A. From David. Let's see. Fred Dury once told me in the mid-60s that the mine on Smith Hill was struck by lightning and caught fire and smoldered deep underground for years. Have you ever heard that, Duane?
That is true. It did smolder underground for many years, you bet.
All right. Cam asks, could you tell us what purpose the Gronk served at the mines and why it's still there?
Yeah, you know, the Gronk, it never was called the Gronk then. That was where the tipple was, and the railroad was right below it. So that's pretty much where the coal came down the tramway and it was dumped into the Denver and Rio Grande coal cars. Yeah, Jane Wirtz, what was the name of the bartender? His name was Chuck Wirtz, W-I-R-T-Z. Later on moved to Bisbee, has since passed away. He, Art Norris, and George Sibley are the three guys, while drinking one night, started Flauschink, 1969.
All right, next question from Kirk. During this time, were folks skiing?
Were they skiing? You better believe it, and we'll save that until I get to the early day skiing in Crested Butte. They skied on Big Mine Hill. They skied on about 1 mile up the Slate at Chicken Ranch. They skied off Chocolate Peak. They skied everywhere. They skied on the flank of Mount Emmons. You bet. We'll talk about that later.
All right, our next question from Jamie. What is the tall arched structure near Peanut Lake? Did it have something to do with mining?
Yeah, well, that's what they call the Gronk that we just talked about. And that is by the tipple, as I said, where the coal came down from the peanut mine and was loaded onto the railroad cars.
Next from Charles. Did Kachevers actually used to be a brothel?
Yes, it was upstairs.
No, the upstairs was never finished.
Well, the story I got was that when Mr. Kochever got married, his wife said that'll end that. So there might be a little dispute on that.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question. Douglas, at its height, what was the population of Crested Butte and how many of those were miners and how many were families and or supported the miners?
You know, I think the peak population of Crested Butte was right at about 1,500. And to give you an idea of how many people were miners, 400 of them worked at the big mine. And then remember, about 70 or 80 worked at anthracite, and another 70 or 80 at Floresta. So there probably were about 600 miners working there at one time.
All right. Andrea notes there was a coal mine office on the south, a few miles from Ohio Pass, lower. Yeah,
you know, you're talking about the area that is called Kubler. And just before you come up the pass, the road forks and Carbon Creek goes to the right. And 3 miles up Carbon Creek was the famous Kubler mine owned by Rocky Mountain Fuel. And then if you stay left and keep going towards Ohio Pass, you'll see a black spot on the left side of the road, and that is where the South Park dead ended at Baldwin, another coal town. So yes, Baldwin and Kubler were two great coal towns up near the head of Ohio Creek.
All right. Annie asks, Kachiever is a common name in Chaffee and Lake County. Were there many of his descendants of the Kachiever descendants?
You know, the Cochevers that I know first came to Crested Butte, and then when the mines began to shut down, they began to move out. So I think a lot of them originally started in Crested Butte and then moved, but there may have been some that I don't know that came into the towns originally.
Robert asks, if we come this summer, can we get a loaf of bread baked in a coke oven?
No, because there are no coke ovens anymore. Now remember, they didn't bake them when the coke ovens were red hot producing coking coal. They put it in there when the coking coal was taken out, but it was still hot.
Jennifer asks, were the Knights of Pythias a black fraternal organization?
No, they weren't. They were just another Catholic organization.
Charles asks, were there any gun duels on Elk?
No, there were not. You know, the interesting thing in the history of the West, I don't think there is one documented gun duel where two guys faced each other on the main street. That's kind of one of the myths of the West. Now, there were a lot of times when guys got shot in the back, or when, like the gunfight at the OK Corral, when, you know, two groups were shooting at each other, but no.
Sarah asks, where is Chocolate Peak?
Chocolate Peak, if you go right up Elk Avenue, and it's the hill directly west of Crested Butte, you know, where they have molten iron in there, and I think going to put a house in now, and they got a bench up there. That's Chocolate Peak. And that's where the kids used to sled down and ski down.
We call it Hippie Hill these days.
Oh, Hippie Hill, okay.
Andrea asks, was Baldwin an anthracite coal mine as well?
Baldwin was primarily bituminous or soft coal. Anthracite coal is pretty rare. That's why we only got two mines in Crested Butte. And I asked a geologist if it was unusual for anthracite and bituminous to be together. And he said, yeah, it's rather unusual for that anthracite and bituminous to be so close together.
Carol asks, what do you know about the Silver Spruce mine on the side of Bellevue, north of Gothic?
All I know about that is one of the early notes I had, and this mine began very early and it didn't really produce very much, but I don't have a whole lot of information on that.
Luann asks, how active was the union?
The union was very active, and the miners belonged to the United Mine Workers. And they, you know, anytime there was a strike, you know, another problem they had, they might be off work for a month or two. That's why they had their own gardens, and that's why they went hunting, and, you know, they had to pretty much provide for themselves.
Barbara asks, have you heard of the SNPJ Lodge?
SNPJ? No.
Right. Sherry,
Tell me about it.
Yeah. Tell us about it, Barbara. I don't know anything about it either. Sherry asks, was the Croatian Hall always across from the Slogar?
You know, I don't know on that. It may have been the one that I told you was moved, but I don't know. I have to check. I'll tell you where you can find out. George Sibley has got a great book on the, you know, the buildings of Crested Butte, and I would yield to George on that one.
That book is called The Crested Butte Primer, and we do have it at the museum if you ever want to check it out. It's in our archives. We don't have them for sale, but you can always do research with us. Let's see, from Kim, is there a mine shaft sealed up on the south side of Scarp Ridge? Is this more of a modern mine or part of the original mining?
Yeah, you know, and I'm afraid he was going to ask that. What's the name of that mine that OSHA is attempting to close now? Oh, Standard Mine. I don't know if that's the one you're thinking of, Standard Mine. The other stuff on Scarp Ridge is pretty much deals with the molybdenum. If you get farther over, where the Molly is below Mount Emmons, that's all Molly, but I don't know of any other mine shaft that was above the Standard Mine, which they're trying to close now.
Carol asks, what about the New York mine up Copper Creek near Queen Basin? Was it a silver mine?
It was a silver mine, but I don't know very much about it, but I have walked right by that on my way through Queens Basin. It didn't last very long.
Kirk asks, you mentioned a Polish influence was considered, blah, 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 blah. You mentioned a Polish influence. Was that considered the Slavic people?
I don't remember ever mentioning the Polish, except, you know, they were part of the Russian Empire. But I mentioned early that just generally, there are more Polish people in Chicago than there are in any city in Poland. But I don't remember very many Polish people coming into Crested Butte, but a lot of them came into Chicago.
All right, so we've just got a couple minutes left. So if anybody's got a question, be sure to pop it in the chat or in the Q&A. Oh, you know what? We have a bunch in the Q&A that I've been ignoring. Here we go. Duel asks, what pushed out the Ku Klux Klan from this area?
The Ku Klux Klan was eliminated by two things. Number one, courageous newspaper editors. And number two, they got the Ku Klux Klan like they got Al Capone. They got him on income tax evasion. You know, they had all this property and all this money, and the federal government said, you know, how come you're not paying taxes on this? And they couldn't say, well, we got it from prostitution or gambling or murder. So they threw him in jail.
Jim asks, did the Masonic fraternity become more visible following the demise of the Catholic societies?
No, the Masons were always a big organization, never very big in Crested Butte because it was pretty much an Anglo or an English organization. And in a lot of ways, I hope I don't offend any Masons, but for some time in history, it really was considered anti-Catholic. So no.
Bill asks, was anthracite coal from Floresta ever shipped to the CF&I mills at Pueblo or only sold as heating coal in the different sizes?
Yeah, it was never used really in Pueblo because bituminous coal was used in the production of iron into steel. A lot of that anthracite coal made its way out to the Midwest, and it's primarily used for heating and industrial purposes. It's hard coal.
All right, Annie asks, any Knights of Columbus organizations?
You know, I'm sure there was, but it would be later on. Not that I remember, not with all the other Catholic organizations and fraternal orders. I don't remember that being very early in Crested Butte.
Linda asks, when was coal last burned in CB?
You mean as a fuel or in the mines?
Let's say as heating, for heating your house.
Yeah, you know, I'd have to go back to the papers, but they had a big controversy, and I'm going to say that in the early 90s, they pretty much shut that down because it was causing a lot of pollution to hang over the town. And I remember it very well, but I'm not real sure on the exact year, but I think it was in the early 90s.
Let's see, Craig asks, was Joe Berta buried in Baldwin? And
yes, he was.
Still standing?
Yeah, and on his tomb is, or on his marker is Man of the Mountains. He, you know, I had a good friend named Drew Sparlin who went hunting with him. And Drew was sitting on a point and he never heard a word or a sound. And Joe Berta tapped him on the shoulder and said in a quiet voice, "Hello, cowboy." And Drew Sparlin said he went about 5 feet in the air. Joe Berta was a man you didn't want to fool with, and he was involved in the Ludlow massacre as one of the miners involved.
Douglas asks, what do you know about the Virginia mine above Gothic next to Avery Peak?
Yeah, the Virginius, IUS at the end, that was a very prominent mine. And one of my students about the middle 1970s, Carl Haase, Haase, wrote a great master's thesis of about 300 pages. And it's called Gothic, City of Silver Wires. And Ian Billick has that at Gothic, and Carl goes into a lot of information on the Virginias. But it was a pretty good silver mine.
Pamela Lowe asks, any idea how the Gronk got its name?
No idea at all. A bunch of locals came up with that one, and I don't know.
It's one of history's mysteries.
That's right.
All right. Well, if you have any last questions, pop them in there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We had over 170 people logged in tonight, which is great. Thank you.
Tell them to get on the chat board, too. I'd like to see who they were.
Yeah, we'd also like to thank our sponsors, Western State Colorado Alumni Relations, Bluebird Realty, and Bill Petros. Thank you for making this program happen. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And we're back next week. What's our topic next week? Polka, right?
Polka time with Pete Dunda, and it will be a special occasion. So those of you who are polka dancers, clear the table. And those of you who don't, you're going to chance to watch Nell and I, and we'll show you how to do the polka. You got to be able to do the polka if you come to Crested Butte.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. I'm definitely looking forward to some polka. I haven't done it in a while.
Yeah, thanks, everybody, for being on board, and I will see you with Pete Dunda coming up. Shelley, thank you for the comments. Phyllis and Rich, thank you very much. Oh, roll out the barrel, says Teresa Parka. Roll out the barrel, you bet.
And you can find the
all right, Vandenbusche over and out.
See you, Duane. And you can find the Spaghetti Gang book at the museum or Townie Books. Thank you, Phyllis and Richard. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, folks.